She was told she was going to take a shower. That single lie was the last thing millions of women ever heard. Between 1939 and 1945, the Nazi regime didn't just wage war against soldiers on a battlefield. It waged war against women. Mothers, teachers, nurses, students, girls who had never held a weapon in their lives. They were rounded up, starved, mistreated, and lost by the millions, simply because of who they were born as. This is not a story you were taught in school. This is the story the history books left out. Before we go further, this video covers real, documented history that many people have never seen laid out like this. If you believe stories like these deserve to be remembered, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Because WW2 Real History brings you the events that shaped our world, told the way they actually happened. No sugarcoating, no shortcuts. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. When Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party seized power, they didn't see people. They saw categories: Jewish, Romani, Polish, Soviet, political enemy. And once a woman was placed into one of those categories, her fate was often already sealed. Jewish women were among the first and largest group targeted. After Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, entire Jewish communities were forced into sealed ghettos. Warsaw RD, Krakow, where families were crammed into a few rooms with almost no food. Women in these ghettos watched their children go hungry in front of them. Nazi patrols conducted sweeps at any hour, taking away anyone who couldn't prove they were useful for labor. Mothers with small children were almost always the first selected for deportation, sent by cattle car to camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, where the vast majority did not survive the day they arrived. Romani women faced a campaign of persecution just as ruthless. The Nazis viewed the Romani people as racially undesirable and set out to erase them entirely. Thousands of Romani families were forced into a section of Auschwitz, Birkenau that prisoners called the Gypsy Camp. Women there suffered in staggering numbers, from starvation, from disease, and from experiments they never consented to. Historians estimate that by 1945, in several European countries, more than 90% of the Romani population had been lost. Polish women were rounded up in mass arrests targeting anyone considered a threat to Nazi control. Teachers, nurses, students, resistance sympathizers. Young Polish women were frequently taken and shipped to Germany as forced laborers. By 1944, close to 1.7 million Polish civilians, a huge number of them women, had been deported into the German labor system. Soviet women endured some of the harshest treatment of the entire war. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Nazi units swept through cities like Leningrad, Kiev, and Minsk, capturing millions of civilians. Anyone suspected of aiding partisan resistance, including nurses and civilians who simply gave food to soldiers, faced brutal punishment, and mass reprisals against civilians became routine. And then there were the political prisoners, women who dared to speak out, journalists who wrote against the regime, students who printed anti-Nazi leaflets, ordinary citizens who hid Jewish neighbors. Many of these women were sent to one place above all others, Ravensbrück, the largest concentration camp built specifically for women. By 1945, more than 100 Zalozan women had passed through Ravensbrück's gates. They arrived after days locked in freight cars without food or water, only to be placed into filthy, overcrowded barracks and forced into grueling labor. Mistreatment was routine. For thousands of women, this was the last address they would ever have. Some of the worst chapters of this history don't involve soldiers at all. They involve men in white coats who called themselves doctors. Joseph Mengele, later nicknamed the Angel of Death, worked at Auschwitz, Birkenau, where he was given near-total authority over the fate of prisoners. He had a particular fixation on twins, pregnant women, and anyone with unusual physical traits. Mengele and his colleagues carried out invasive procedures without proper anesthesia. introduced unknown substances into women's bodies just to observe the results, and tested methods intended to prevent women from ever having children. Survivors described lasting pain, severe infections, and permanent injury. Some women were forced into pregnancy, and then had it ended purely so Mengele could study the process. He escaped to South America after the war and lived the rest of his life without ever being held accountable, passing away in 1979. At Ravensbrück K, a surgeon named Karl Gebhardt carried out a different kind of harm. He selected a group of young Polish women, prisoners who came to be known among themselves as the rabbits, and used their bodies to test how the human body recovered from severe battlefield-style trauma. Their legs were deliberately wounded and deliberately contaminated so doctors could study how infections spread and how the body healed. Some had bones or tissue removed entirely to test different surgical methods. At least 74 women were subjected to these procedures, and many were left with permanent disabilities. After the war, survivors traveled to Nuremberg and testified against him. Gebhardt was convicted at trial and put to death in 1948. One of the very few responsible parties who ever faced consequences. Preventing women from having children became a central Nazi obsession, driven directly by orders from Heinrich Himmler. Karl Kloberg, working out of Block 10 at Auschwitz, introduced a caustic substance directly into women's reproductive organs, searching for a fast, cheap way to permanently sterilize entire populations. The procedure caused severe internal damage and life-threatening infections. Other doctors experimented with high-dose radiation for the same purpose, leaving many women with permanent illness or worse. These weren't isolated acts of cruelty. They were part of a deliberate, organized program aimed at erasing entire ethnic groups by targeting their ability to have families. Beyond the medical horrors, the Nazi system was built on one core idea: human beings, especially captured women, were disposable resources. Some women were forced into what the SS called special buildings, a system set up at Mauthausen in 1942 and later expanded to camps including Buchenwald, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen. Women, most between the ages of 16 and 30, were often lured with false promises of better food or lighter work. Once inside, they had no way out, and refusal meant severe punishment or being sent back to face almost certain death. Many did not survive long under these conditions. Outside the camps, German forces treated the women of occupied nations as targets too. In 1942, Himmler issued orders for the mass roundup of Polish women, with many funneled into forced servitude for German troops. In cities across Eastern Europe, secret facilities disguised as rest centers were actually sites of organized abuse against Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian women, whom Nazi ideology labeled as racially inferior and therefore without any say in the matter. For women who became pregnant as a result of this mistreatment, the outcome was almost always more suffering. Nazi policy did not want children born under these circumstances, particularly if the mother was Jewish, Polish, or Romani. Pregnant prisoners at Auschwitz were frequently among the first sent to their deaths on arrival. Others were forced into procedures to end their pregnancies under harsh, unsafe conditions. Romani women who did give birth in the camps often had their infants taken from them almost immediately. Forced labor was its own kind of slow destruction. Women worked in quarries, munitions factories, and construction sites for up to 14 hours a day, on starvation rations, wearing rags and wooden shoes that fell apart within weeks. At the Mauthausen quarry, women were forced to haul heavy stones up 186 stone steps that prisoners came to call the stairs of death. A fall there was almost always fatal. The work was so punishing that many women did not survive their first few weeks. German industrial giants profited directly from this system. Companies including Siemens and IG Farben used thousands of enslaved women from camps like Ravensbrück and Auschwitz to manufacture weapons, electrical components, and synthetic rubber. At IG Farben's massive Bohner factory next to Auschwitz, toxic fumes damaged workers' health daily. Company records referred to these women simply as labor, never as people. For millions of women, capture wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a much shorter one. In late September 1941, SS units gathered more than 33,000 Jewish civilians, overwhelmingly women, children, and the elderly, at a ravine outside Kiev called Babi Yar, where nearly all of them lost their lives over the following 2 days. The site continued to be used for mass killings for 2 more years. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, arriving trains were met on the platform by SS officers, sometimes including Mengele himself, who decided within seconds who would be sent to forced labor and who would not survive the day. Pregnant women, mothers with young children, and anyone who looked too weak to work were rarely selected to live. They were told they were being taken to shower and did not come back out. Between 1942 and 1944, hundreds of thousands of women and children from Hungary, Poland, France, Greece, and beyond lost their lives this way. 1943. The Nazis launched what they cynically named Operation Harvest Festival, a coordinated action over just a few days that claimed more than 42,000 Jewish prisoners at the Majdanek, Troniki, and Poniatowa camps in occupied Poland, most of them women. It remains one of the single largest mass killings of the entire war. At Ravensbrück, thousands of female resistance fighters, French, Polish, and Soviet women who had helped hide Jewish families or spread anti-Nazi information, were put to death for their actions. As Allied forces closed in during early 1945, these actions only accelerated, as Nazi officials rushed to eliminate as many prisoners as possible before liberation could reach them. By the time Allied troops reached the camps in 1945, the damage was almost beyond comprehension. At Ravensbrück alone, roughly 50 Zalhausen women had already lost their lives before Soviet forces arrived. The survivors found by British and American soldiers at Bergen, Belsen, and Buchenwald were so weakened by starvation and illness that liberators struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. At the Nuremberg trials that followed, a small number of the men responsible, including Karl Gebhardt, were convicted and punished. But the overwhelming majority of those responsible for the suffering of women during the Holocaust were never held accountable. Joseph Mengele lived free for over 3 decades. Countless camp guards and officials quietly rebuilt ordinary lives. The women who did survive carried the weight of what happened to them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke out, testifying so the world would never be allowed to forget. Others never spoke of it again. Today, memorials stand at Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Babi Yar, quiet reminders of what happened on that ground. But the stories of the women who lived through it are still not as widely known as they should be. If this video opened your eyes to a part of history you'd never heard told this way, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe to WW2 Real History so you don't miss the next story. Hit the like button so more people see this, and share it with someone who needs to understand what really happened. These women can't tell their own stories anymore, so we owe it to them to keep telling it for them. Thank you for watching.